me crunchy chocolate.
Hey dummies, welcome back to Game Baking, a show where I dissect and discuss the making of a game every month while I take on the One Game a Month challenge. For the month of March, I participated in a tiny jam which you may know as
Wowie! Game Jam!
Hosted by big boy YouTuber Jonas Tyroller. Let's jump right in.
The theme.
This time around, the theme was Failure is Progress. Now, this can be interpreted and implemented a couple of different ways, but of course, the very first thing that comes to mind is die in order to progress the game. In fact, Jonas himself gives this as an example in the theme's announcement video. Swapping the lose condition for the win condition is lazy. It's the laziest way to implement this theme, so I'm not doing that. I still want to have a win condition. Because of this, I avoided this interpretation at all costs, because I figured that 90% of the submissions would probably be this exact concept. I've seen similar themes to this one in previous jams, and here's my controversial take on it. I feel very strongly about if taking damage is intentional, then it's no longer a fail state, because that's the main game mechanic. So now it's no different than picking up points if taking damage is something you have to do to progress. I don't feel like it's implementing it's just surface level implementation. It's like when you skin something. You take an existing character and you just swap it out for different sprites. It's still the same character, you're still collecting damage to move forward instead of collecting coins. It doesn't make a difference. There's no fail state there. You're not doing anything you don't want to do in order to progress. I don't want the player to seek failure in order to progress. I want them to play a game like they normally would, where they're aiming for success, and then along the way, when they fail, progress occurs. Also, I was working with a slightly larger team this time around. Travis Hull returned to compose the music and provide sound effects, but I was also lucky enough to have an illustrator, Freya, and a 3D modeler, Tadiokor, join me for this jam.
The concept.
I didn't want to take a regular mechanic and reskin it to make it seem like failure. And I didn't want to implement a failure mechanic that players will intentionally exploit to the point where it no longer feels like failure. So how do I implement a mechanic that actually feels like failure to the point where players will fight to avoid it, but that still leads to progress when the player triggers it?
I don't get it.
How about a grid-based, turn-based strategy collectible card game? But one where the units and actions are both represented by cards, and losing a unit means you have a new slot open for an action card when you draw new cards on your next turn. Here's what we came up with. Hey everyone, I'm Trash, this channel is trash, and you're trash. That's why you should like this video, subscribe to my channel, come join me on Discord, and support me on Patreon.
The meat.
I started by writing a simple script that generates a grid, and then building an unnecessary elaborate system for calculating the possible paths a unit can take on that grid.
I just think I'm too stupid to understand this.
I know there are a bunch of available options out there that do exactly that, from open source projects to purchasable assets, but for some reason I just enjoy reinventing the wheel and shooting myself in the foot like that.
Wow, a gun! I wonder if it's loaded. No.
The paths are calculated based on a variety of different values and conditions. The types of tile in the way, the location of ally and enemy units, whether the unit you're moving is a land or air unit, the minimum and maximum number of tiles the unit can travel, and the number of tiles that need to be hopped over. In this game, movement limitations aren't dictated by units, but rather by action cards, which include attack cards and movement cards. Movement cards have minimum and maximum movement values, so for example, the long run card has a minimum value of 2 and a maximum value of 6, so if put into play, the unit has to move by at least 2 tiles. And some movement cards have special attributes, like the long jump card, which is essentially the same as the long run one, except the unit will be jumping to the new tile rather than running there, which means obstacle tiles won't affect how far the unit can go unless they're tall obstacles. Speaking of tiles, there are 4 of them in the game. Regular tiles, which are free to step on, small obstacles, which land units can only cross by jumping but air units can fly over, large obstacles, which block all units and moves, and slowdown tiles, which require 2 moves for land units to walk through, but air units can fly over as normal.
Here is how it works.
When selecting a movement card and a unit, the first thing that is checked are the tiles around the unit to see if any are obstacles or slowdown tiles. In this case, we have 1 of each type of tile around the unit. We can then check to see if the unit is flying. If it is, then we add these 3 tiles as possible first moves, since the unit will be flying over the slowdown tile and small obstacle tile. But in this case, we've selected a land unit, so we have a few additional checks to do. First, is the card's number of steps larger than 1? If yes, we can add the slowdown tile to the list of possible options. Second, if the action card's jump boolean is set to true, the small obstacle can be added, and the slowdown tile will only require 1 step to walk over rather than 2. Here's the number of steps we have left in each direction. You'll notice the path that goes over the slowdown tile has 1 less step left. That's because the selected card's jump boolean is set to false in this case. From that point, we loop through each of the selected tiles and check the tiles around those that aren't the tile the unit came from. And the process repeats itself until there are no more steps left to take. Since the action card has a minimum steps required, we now disable the tiles below that number. And done! Once the movement was all set up, it was time to move on to creating the content and interactions. This means actual cards you can use, implementing the core slot mechanic, the turn system, and the enemy AI. First, I used scriptable objects to create the units, tiles, and actions. I also created a level scriptable object that accepts 2 2D arrays of tiles and units. This acts as a baseline for generating the grid. Have I mentioned how much I love scriptable objects? They're great. In the meantime, the really awesome team I was working with came up with assets for me to implement into the game. We thought that maybe a cans versus bottles theme would be cool and unique, so Freya came up with these character concepts and started working on artwork for the cards. Shortly after, Tadeo converted those concepts into really great looking models, animated them too.
I like this. This is cute.
The slot mechanic was pretty easy to implement. At the start of each round, I check the number of unit cards you have in your hand. If there's less than 6, I fill the remaining slots with action cards that are randomly drawn from the deck of action cards. I made it so that only action cards are interactable. Next, I wanted the cards to float around in physical space as opposed to just being UI elements.
Well, something's happening.
So I thought it would be cool to have them hang out at the bottom of the screen and rotate as you move the cursor around. I've seen this sort of 3D card effect done before, so I thought now would be the best time to take a crack at it myself. I started by writing a simple mask shader to contain the illustration and background inside of the card. Next, I wrote a second, very basic shader that simply renders the inner faces of whatever model it's on. I then created a set of materials with that second shader, a blue one for unit cards, a purple one for movement cards, and a red one for attack cards. Then applied them to a capsule. Now that only the inside of that capsule renders out, I apply the mask shader to the card material and place the capsule inside the card object. And the last step would be to place the card illustration inside the capsule to complete the effect. Neato! And then came time for the part I dreaded working on the most.
The enemy AI.
Well, I mean, how hard can it be, right? I already had the card, hand, and deck systems, path calculations, unit attacking, and turns implemented. And the best part is that all of those triggered events when activated. All I had to do was use the same player class and have an enemy manager class that calls the necessary methods and listens to events, right? Right?
Nope.
You see, the issue here isn't whether or not the enemies can perform actions. It's the decisions that lead to making those actions. Thinking, oh, I'll just move the unit close to the enemy unit first and then attack it, is really simple for us humans, but the enemies are silly dum-dums, and unless I program them to check all the possible actions and evaluate the best course of action to take, they just do random things like this. So I did exactly that. Here's a quick breakdown. Loop through each unit and apply each action card to see if any viable moves can be performed. For attack cards, check to see if a player unit can be attacked from current position. For movement cards, check distance between selected unit and every player unit to find closest one, and then check if movement card can be used to move closer to that unit. If the card leads to no possible actions, simply discard it. Once a list of first moves is established, loop through the remaining cards again to form a list of second moves that can be done after each first move. Repeat this process until all cards are used up and you have a complete list of possible movesets. And then just randomly select a set of moves from the list and play through it.
Oops, my anarchy symbol.
I know, it's essentially a set of nested for loops, which is incredibly inefficient, and having the final decision be made randomly instead of using a weighted decision system of sorts kind of contradicts the whole overkill system that comes before it. But I did this in one weekend, give me a break. I also used Dutween to create simple movement and attack animations. That's janky. And now, say hello to
Overscoping and feature creep.
Here's a list of features that my dumb brain thought I could implement into this game in just one weekend.
What? What an idiot!
After the enemy AI was passable, it was time to move on to, oh no, I'm almost out of time! Time to cram all this stuff into a scene and ship it! I slammed some post-processing effects on top of the camera and a very basic start menu, then submitted it to the jam. Phew, I did it. I finally did it. I've submitted a Game Jam game before the deadline for once. As always, I wasn't really happy with my submission, so once the jam was over, I continued working on the game to implement a few improvements and some of the features I didn't have time to implement. I tweaked the card animations a bit to improve the user experience, added some card stats below the selected action card, and made the enemy show you what action cards they're playing. I also reworked the enemy AI a bit to be more efficient. While working on those, I took the opportunity to add a couple other UI elements, such as this new overlay text that announces the turns, and a tooltip that shows you information about cards or tiles when you hover your cursor over them. I also added a new main menu by offsetting panels inside a parent panel and animating it to slide around when specific buttons are pressed. In that menu, I created a new pre-match setup screen that allows you to pick and place your units before a match begins. It's still missing some key information, like what obstacles are in the level and where the enemy units are in relation to you, so you can place your units strategically. On the right is where you select what action cards you want in your deck this match. Speaking of deck building, I also included a new shop to purchase and unlock new cards using the currency, represented by bottle caps that you earn by defeating enemies. And finally, I scrapped the post-processing effect I had on there and changed the whole game's visual style to being cel-shaded and more cartoon-like. Oh, also I added this cursor that rotates in the direction you move. Whee!
The ordeal.
No, I'm done. I'm pulling the plug on this segment.
Malfunction.
As much as I like making these videos somewhat educational, I don't think that slapping a segment at the end is the way to go. I thought that exploring one aspect of game dev used in each video's game in a more in-depth fashion would be cool, but I think they're not as engaging and kind of slow these videos down to a crawl. And I also realized that some people watch these videos to see a game get made, but not necessarily to learn something new. Not everyone who enjoys watching the metaphorical game sausage get made is also a cook, or game dev themselves. So I'm cutting this segment out and starting a new separate series that specifically focuses on teaching aspects of game dev. If that's something that might interest you, subscribe to this channel.
If you like this devlog, then subscribe to this channel for more. And maybe give this video a like.
And hey, if you want to be a part of my army of dummies, join my Discord server and consider supporting me on Patreon. Thanks for watching and stay tuned for more videos from me soon.
Stay awake.